A doctor stands over a 4-year-old boy's bed and delivers a death sentence. "Your boy is lost," he tells the father. "There's no point in going to the trouble of looking after him." The child hears these words. He survives. And decades later, he'll revolutionize how we understand human psychology. But first, he'll have to overcome something most people never escape: the crushing weight of feeling inferior. Alfred Adler didn't just study inferiority, he lived it. And that's exactly what made him dangerous to the established order of psychology. This is the story of how a sickly child from Vienna's outskirts became the man who dared to tell Sigmund Freud he was wrong, walked away from the most powerful circle in psychiatry, and built a theory of human nature that still shapes how we think about ourselves today. February 7th, 1870, Maria-Hilfer-Strasse, 208, Rudolfsheim, a village clinging to Vienna's western edge. The Adler family welcomes their second son into a world that will try to kill him repeatedly. Leopold Adler, a Hungarian grain merchant, and his wife Pauline now have 7 children to feed. Alfred arrives into a household where survival isn't guaranteed and affection isn't equally distributed. The first trauma comes when Alfred is 3 years old. He wakes up one morning in the bed he shares with his younger brother Rudolf. Except Rudolf isn't breathing. The boy is dead. Diphtheria has claimed him during the night, and Alfred has been sleeping next to a corpse. Imagine processing that at 3 years old. Your brain barely understands what death means, and it's lying inches from your face. But death isn't finished with Alfred yet. His body betrays him early. Rickets sets in, a disease that softens bones and twists limbs. While other children run and play, Alfred can't walk. He watches from windows and doorways as life happens without him. The condition keeps him immobile until he's 4 years old. 4 years of depending on others for everything. 4 years of watching his older brother Sigmund move freely through the world while he remains trapped. Then comes the pneumonia. Alfred is 5 when the fever takes hold. His breathing becomes laboured, then desperate. A doctor is summoned. The man examines the boy and turns to Leopold Adler with the kind of brutal honesty that passed for medical practice in 1875. "Your boy is lost. There's no point in going to the trouble of looking after him, as there's no hope of his living." Alfred hears this. The words burn into his consciousness with a terror so complete it will shape everything that follows. The doctor has pronounced him worthless, not worth the effort of care, already dead. And something happens in that moment of absolute fear. A decision forms in the mind of a dying 5-year-old. If he survives this, he'll become a doctor himself. He'll have a better defense against death. The fever breaks. Alfred lives, but survival doesn't mean recovery. It means carrying forward with a body that's failed him repeatedly, and a psyche marked by trauma. He's been run over by carts twice in the streets. He's witnessed his brother's death. He's heard medical authority declare him lost, and he's keenly aware that his mother prefers his older brother, Sigmund, to him. This preference isn't subtle. Pauline Adler makes it clear, through 1,000 small actions, that Sigmund is the favoured son. Alfred feels this rejection deeply, and it creates a rivalry that will define his childhood. He's not just competing with his brother for achievement, he's competing for his mother's love, and he's losing. Yet here's what's fascinating. Alfred doesn't withdraw. Despite the physical frailty, despite the emotional wounds, he becomes an active, popular child. His father Leopold supports him, refuses to give up on him, provides the counterbalance to his mother's rejection, and Alfred fights back against his circumstances with a determination that borders on defiance. School reveals another dimension of his struggle. Math becomes his worst subject, a source of humiliation. A teacher even suggests that Leopold should forget about education and apprentice Alfred to a cobbler instead. Make shoes. Accept your limitations. Know your place. Leopold refuses, and one day, something shifts. The math instructor poses a problem to the class. The best student attempts it and fails. The instructor tries and also fails. Then Alfred raises his hand. He solves it. In that moment, the narrative changes. The boy who couldn't walk, who nearly died, who was supposed to become a cobbler, has just outperformed everyone in mathematics. He goes on to top his math class. This pattern, this transformation, from inadequacy to competence, through sheer determined effort, becomes the template for everything Adler will later teach about human psychology. The Adler household isn't wealthy, but it's culturally rich. Vienna in the 1870s and 80s is entering its golden age. The city pulses with music, theatre, literature, and intellectual ferment. Leopold and Pauline, despite their economic struggles, immerse their children in this culture. One brother plays and teaches violin. A sister masters piano, and Alfred, despite the throat problems from his childhood illnesses, develops a beautiful tenor voice. By age 4, he's singing entire operettas. He attends every opera and play running in Vienna. People hear his voice and encourage him to abandon science for a career on the stage. But Alfred has made his decision. He's going to become a doctor. Death has come for him too many times, and he's going to learn how to fight back. The family's economic situation fluctuates. They experience both relative prosperity and near poverty. This exposes young Alfred to different social classes, to the arbitrary nature of status, to the way society judges worth based on external circumstances rather than human value. He sees how the wealthy are treated versus the poor. He notices who receives respect and who receives contempt. These observations are filing away, building toward a psychological theory that will emphasize social factors over biological determinism. Meanwhile, the rivalry with Sigmund intensifies. Alfred isn't just competing academically. He's competing for recognition, for validation, for proof that he matters despite his mother's preference for his brother. This competition drives him forward, but also creates a sensitivity to hierarchies and power dynamics that will later inform his critique of Freud's authoritarian approach to psychology. At the University of Vienna Medical School, Alfred finally pursues his childhood vow. He enrolls in 1895 and completes his degree in the same year. But medical school does more than train him in anatomy and disease. It connects him to a circle of socialist students who are questioning everything about Austrian society: class structures, gender roles, political authority, the distribution of wealth and power. In this circle, he meets Raisa Timofeyevna Epstein. She's Russian, an intellectual, a social activist, and a militant socialist. She's also friends with Leon Trotsky. Raisa is everything Alfred's traditional Viennese background hasn't prepared him for: politically radical, feminist, uncompromising in her convictions. And she's about to become his wife. They marry in 1897 in Smolensk. Raisa's influence on Alfred's thinking cannot be overstated. Her feminist perspective pushes him toward views on gender equality that are virtually unprecedented among psychologists of his era. Years later, Alfred will advocate for women's rights so forcefully that a Danish sculptor includes him in a memorial statue featuring 99 famous women and one famous man. That man is Alfred Adler. But in 1897, he's just a newly married doctor trying to establish his practice. He chooses an unusual location, near the Prater, Vienna's famous amusement park, in a lower-class neighbourhood. His patients are circus performers, acrobats, people whose bodies are their livelihood. He treats strongmen with hernias, contortionists with joint problems, performers whose physical abilities are both their greatest assets and their vulnerabilities. This clinical experience becomes crucial. Watching these patients compensate for physical limitations, seeing how they develop extraordinary abilities in one area to offset weaknesses in another, Alfred begins formulating ideas about organ inferiority and psychological compensation. The strong man with the weak heart who builds massive muscles, the acrobat with poor eyesight who develops exceptional kinesthetic awareness. The pattern is everywhere once you start looking for it. And Alfred is looking because he's lived this pattern himself. The sickly child who couldn't walk became the active, popular boy. The math failure became the top student. The boy pronounced lost became the doctor. Compensation isn't just a theory, it's his autobiography. Between 1898 and 1909, Raisa gives birth to 4 children: Valentina, Alexandra, Kurt and Cornelia. The family lives simply but comfortably. Alfred and Raisa create a household where each child is respected as an individual, where democratic principles replace authoritarian parenting. Their daughter Alexandra will later describe her relationship with her father as close and positive, a privilege to follow in his footsteps into psychiatry. Their son Kurt will say that everyone in the family felt respected, that no one had to search for their identity because it was validated from the start. This family structure isn't accidental. It's Alfred's theory in practice, the same principles he'll later teach to thousands of parents in child guidance clinics he's implementing in his own home. But the theory hasn't fully formed yet. That will require another encounter, another relationship, another rivalry that will make his childhood competition with Sigmund look trivial by comparison. Around 1900, Alfred begins exploring psychopathology. His medical practice has exposed him to patients whose problems aren't purely physical. Their bodies manifest symptoms that seem connected to psychological distress. He's searching for frameworks to understand this connection between mind and body, between social circumstance and mental health. Then he hears about a doctor in Vienna who's developing radical theories about the unconscious mind and the sexual origins of neurosis. The doctor's name is Sigmund Freud. In 1902, Alfred accepts an invitation to join Freud's discussion group, the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. He arrives not as a blank slate or a student, but as an already accomplished physician with his own developing theories. He's published work on social medicine. He's been thinking deeply about organ inferiority and compensation. He's bringing his own intellectual capital to the table. This matters because history has gotten the relationship between Adler and Freud catastrophically wrong. The standard story goes like this. Adler was Freud's disciple, his student, who learned psychoanalysis from the master and then betrayed him by breaking away. Even today, textbooks describe Adler as a pupil of Freud. This version is fiction. Freud himself referred to Alfred in print in 1909 as my colleague, Dr. Alfred Adler. They were colleagues. Alfred defended Freud's early theories when the medical establishment dismissed them. He helped Freud gain recognition in psychiatry. The popular, charismatic Adler brought legitimacy and social skills that the more isolated Freud lacked. But the myth of discipleship persists, and it enraged Alfred for the rest of his life. Abraham Maslow once witnessed Alfred's reaction to being called Freud's student. According to Maslow, Alfred became furious, flushed, talked so loudly that others turned to stare. He called it a lie and a swindle that he blamed entirely on Freud. He had never been a student, never a disciple, never a follower. Yet that's exactly how history remembers him. The myth served Freud's purposes, positioning him as the father of psychoanalysis, from whom all other theories descended. But it erases Alfred's independent contributions and distorts the actual dynamic between two colleagues who happened to disagree. And disagree they did, profoundly. In 1907, Alfred publishes Study of Organ Inferiority and its Psychical Compensation. The book argues that people compensate psychologically for physical disabilities and the attendant feelings of inferiority. When compensation fails, neurosis results. It's a theory grounded in Alfred's clinical observations and personal experience, and it's incompatible with Freud's sexual determinism. Freud's framework traces all neurosis back to sexual conflicts in early childhood. Alfred increasingly rejects this. He sees sexuality as one factor among many, often symbolic rather than literal. He emphasizes social factors, conscious striving, the individual's creative response to their circumstances. Where Freud sees humans driven by unconscious sexual drives, Alfred sees people actively constructing their lives in pursuit of goals. The tension builds through the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society meetings. Alfred speaks up, challenges Freud's interpretations, offers alternative explanations. Other members notice. Some are intrigued, others are scandalized. You don't contradict Freud in his own discussion group. By 1911, the break becomes inevitable. The Psychoanalytic Society convenes on February 4th, 1911. The room is tense. Everyone knows what's coming. Alfred has been asked to present his theories for formal discussion, for evaluation, for judgment. He speaks for hours across 3 meetings. He lays out his framework systematically. The inferiority feeling as the foundation of neurosis, the masculine protest against perceived weakness, the creative power of the individual to construct their own personality, social factors outweighing sexual ones, conscious striving toward goals rather than determination by unconscious drives. It's a comprehensive rejection of Freudian orthodoxy presented with clinical evidence and logical precision. Freud listens, his supporters listen, and when Alfred finishes, the verdict comes swiftly. The society votes on whether Alfred's views are compatible with psychoanalysis. 14 members vote no. 9 vote yes. The majority has spoken. Alfred's theories are deemed heretical. But here's what matters more than the vote. 9 members walk out with Alfred, 9 colleagues who've heard both sides, and choose his framework over Freud's. They don't leave reluctantly. They leave purposefully, ready to build something new. On June 9th, 1911, Alfred formally resigns from the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. He resigns from the editorial board of the Psychoanalytic Journal. He walks away from the institutional structure Freud controls. Freud had threatened to resign from the journal if Alfred's name remained on the editorial board. Alfred made the decision easy. He left entirely, but before the final break, Freud made one last attempt at reconciliation. He invited Alfred to dinner, a private conversation, a chance to resolve their differences. They met, they talked, no resolution emerged. Alfred asked the question that crystallized everything. Why should I always do my work under your shadow? There it is. The fundamental issue wasn't just theoretical disagreement. It was about autonomy, recognition, the right to develop ideas independently without being forever classified as derivative. Freud wanted disciples who would extend his theories while acknowledging his primacy. Alfred wanted to be a colleague pursuing truth wherever it led, even if that meant contradicting the man who'd invited him into psychoanalytic circles. They never saw each other again. 9 years of collaboration ended in a single evening. The 2 men who'd once defended each other's work became rivals whose names would be forever linked in psychology textbooks. Their split analysed by generations of scholars. But while Freud held grudges with the intensity of a wounded parent, Alfred moved forward. He had work to do, theories to develop, patients to treat, a new society to build. In 1912, the Society for Individual Psychology forms. That name deserves attention. Individual psychology in German carries different connotations than in English. The German individual psychology doesn't mean psychology of the individual as opposed to the group. It means the psychology of the indivisible, undivided person. Alfred is making a philosophical statement. You can't fragment human beings into competing drives and instincts. You can't reduce personality to sexual energy transformed through defense mechanisms. People are unified wholes, indivisible. Their psychology must be understood holistically. This becomes the foundation of everything Alfred builds. The person as a creative, goal-directed unity. Not a battleground of ego and superego. Not a puppet controlled by unconscious sexual wishes. A whole human being making choices, pursuing aims, constructing meaning. In 1912, Alfred publishes The Neurotic Constitution, his first major systematic presentation of individual psychology. The book lays out the framework completely. Inferiority feelings arise from actual or perceived inadequacy. People compensate through striving for superiority, for significance, for completion. When compensation succeeds, you get healthy development. When it fails, you get neurosis. But it's more complex than simple compensation. Alfred introduces the concept of the style of life, or lifestyle. This is the unique pattern each person develops for moving from a felt minus to a perceived plus. Your lifestyle is how you've learned to navigate the world, to overcome obstacles, to pursue your goals. And here's the revolutionary part. Your lifestyle isn't determined by your past. It's created by you. You're the artist of your own personality. Your early experiences matter, but they matter because of how you interpret them. What conclusions you draw, what strategies you develop in response. Two children face the same difficulty. One concludes, I must work harder. The other concludes, I'm helpless. Same experience, different interpretations, different lifestyles. The difference isn't in what happened, it's in what the child made of what happened. This puts human agency at the center of psychology. You're not a victim of your unconscious. You're not determined by early childhood sexuality. You're a creative being who constructs your personality through the meanings you assign to your experiences. Freud saw this framework as naive, as ignoring the power of unconscious forces. Alfred saw Freud's framework as diminishing human dignity and responsibility. The theoretical differences go deeper still. Freud's psychology is reductive. Complex behaviors are explained by reducing them to simpler underlying drives. Sexual energy gets transformed, sublimated, repressed, but it's always sexual energy at the root. Alfred's psychology is teleological. Behavior is explained by the goals it serves, the future it aims toward. You can't understand what someone is doing by looking backward at causes. You have to look forward at purposes. Why does this patient develop anxiety? Freud looks to childhood sexual conflicts. Alfred looks to current situations where anxiety serves a purpose, often unconscious. Maybe anxiety excuses avoiding challenges. Maybe it elicits sympathy and care. Maybe it allows the person to feel special, different, burdened with sensitivity others lack. The anxiety isn't random, it's functional. It's achieving something for the person, even as it causes suffering. To cure it, you don't excavate childhood memories. You help the person recognize what their symptom accomplishes and find healthier ways to meet those needs. This shift from causality to teleology changes everything about therapy. Freudian analysis digs into the past, excavating memories, interpreting dreams, waiting for unconscious material to surface through free association. Adlerian therapy focuses on present functioning and future goals. What are you trying to achieve in life? What's preventing you? How can we modify your lifestyle to pursue your aims more effectively? It's practical. It's forward-looking. It assumes people can change because they're not prisoners of their past. They're authors who can rewrite their stories. Birth order becomes one of Alfred's most famous contributions. Not because birth order determines personality, but because it creates different social situations that children interpret differently. The firstborn child experiences a fall from grace when the second child arrives. They were once the center of attention. Now they must share. How they interpret this experience shapes their lifestyle. Some become responsible, conscientious, aligned with parental authority. Others become discouraged, dethroned, struggling to reclaim their lost position. The second child is born into a race. There's someone ahead, someone to catch up to. This can inspire ambition, competitiveness, revolutionary spirit. The second child may surpass the first by choosing different territory, developing different strengths. The youngest child is pampered, often spoiled, but also faces the challenge of being smaller, less capable than all the others. Some develop charm and creativity to compensate. Others remain dependent, expecting others to solve their problems. The only child never loses parental attention, but also never learns to share, to compete with equals. They often develop adult-oriented social skills while struggling with peer relationships. These patterns aren't deterministic. They're tendencies based on typical family dynamics. What matters isn't your birth order position itself. What matters is how you experienced it, what it meant to you, what strategies you developed in response. Alfred is mapping the social landscape of childhood, showing how family structure creates different psychological challenges. But he never reduces personality to birth order. That would violate his own principles. You're more than your position in the family constellation. You're what you made of that position. The real genius of Alfred's framework emerges in his concept of social interest. In German, Gemeinschaftsgefühl, community feeling, a sense of belonging to humanity, of being part of something larger than yourself. This becomes the criterion for mental health in Adlerian psychology. Neurosis isn't about repressed sexuality, it's about deficient social interest. The neurotic person has turned inward, become preoccupied with their own significance, their own superiority, their own concerns. They've lost connection to the broader human community. Health means developing social interest, contributing to others, finding your place in the collective life of humanity, not through self-sacrifice, not through denying your own needs, but through recognizing that your individual flourishing is bound up with the flourishing of others. This is profoundly different from Freud's vision of civilization as a compromise between individual drives and social necessity. For Freud, we're fundamentally antisocial beings who must be civilized through repression and sublimation. For Alfred, we're fundamentally social beings who become neurotic when we lose sight of our connection to others. The implications are political. If mental health requires social interest, then creating a healthy society means fostering conditions where people can develop connection, contribution, belonging. Poverty, inequality, oppression, these aren't just economic problems, they're psychological problems because they interfere with social interest. Alfred's wife Rosa had been pushing these ideas for years. Her socialist politics, her feminism, they infiltrate Alfred's psychology in ways that make his framework unique among early psychotherapeutic schools. Consider his views on gender. While Freud was theorizing penis envy and female development as a deviation from the male norm, Alfred was arguing for complete equality between men and women. The masculine protest he described wasn't about biology. It was about cultural devaluation of femininity that makes both men and women equate masculinity with strength and femininity with weakness. This cultural fiction damages everyone. Men feel compelled to prove their masculinity through dominance and aggression. Women internalize inferiority or exhaust themselves trying to compete on masculine terms. The solution isn't accepting gender hierarchy, it's dismantling it. These ideas were radical in 1912. They remain challenging today. Alfred was advocating gender equality decades before it became mainstream in psychology or society. His framework demanded it because inferiority imposed by social structures violates human dignity and prevents the development of social interest. A Danish sculptor named Thyra Boldsen later created a memorial statue featuring 99 famous women and one man. The man was Alfred Adler. Recognition that his advocacy for women's equality was genuinely exceptional. By 1914, individual psychology has a complete theoretical framework, a growing society of practitioners, and a vision radically different from Freudian psychoanalysis. Alfred is 44 years old. His ideas are spreading. His clinical practice flourishes. The future looks promising. Then Europe tears itself apart. World War I begins in August 1914. Within months, the Austro-Hungarian Empire mobilizes. Alfred is drafted in 1916 as a military doctor. He's sent to the Russian front, first to Krakow, then to Brünn. Everything he's built halts. The society suspends meetings, publications cease, clinical work stops. Alfred finds himself in a very different role, treating soldiers whose wounds are both physical and psychological. The experience will transform him, not his theory, which remains fundamentally intact, but his priorities, his sense of urgency, his conviction that psychology must serve humanity's survival. Because what Alfred witnesses on the front isn't just individual neurosis, it's collective insanity on a scale that makes individual psychopathology seem trivial. And it forces a question that will haunt him for the rest of his life. If human beings are capable of this, if civilized nations can descend into mechanized slaughter, What does psychology have to offer? What good are theories about lifestyle and social interest when the world is burning? The answer comes in stages, and none of them are simple. Alfred's first duty is triage, deciding who lives, who dies, who returns to fight. A military doctor doesn't heal, he sorts. This soldier's wound will heal enough for the trenches. This one won't survive transport. This one gets morphine and a quiet corner to die. The decisions are impossible, and Alfred makes them every day. He's treating what they call shell shock, soldiers who shake uncontrollably, who can't speak, who wake screaming from nightmares. The official position is that these men are cowards, malingerers. The treatment is punishment, shame, sometimes execution for desertion. Alfred sees something different. He sees psychological trauma as real as any physical wound. More devastating in some ways because invisible. His observations lead to lectures and articles on war neurosis, what we'd now call post-traumatic stress disorder. He's documenting something medicine doesn't yet have language for: psychological wounds that don't heal when the fighting stops. Minds shattered not by weakness, but by exposure to horrors no human psyche was designed to process. The work is crushing. Alfred desperately wants to let them off, to spare men from returning to the meat grinder. But his duty requires the opposite. Recovered enough to walk, back to the front. Can hold a rifle, back to the front. The recovery he's facilitating isn't healing. It's recycling human beings through a system designed to destroy them. Between 1916 and 1918, Alfred witnesses mechanized slaughter on a scale that makes individual neurosis seem quaint. Poison gas, artillery barrages that last days, trenches where men live in mud and corpses. This isn't aberrant human behavior. This is civilization at its most organized. Nations mobilizing every resource, every technological advance, every ounce of social cooperation toward mutual annihilation. It forces a confrontation with his own theory. If social interest is the measure of mental health, what does this say about society itself? These soldiers aren't individually pathological. They're functioning exactly as their culture demands, following orders, serving their country, demonstrating loyalty and courage. The pathology isn't in them. It's in the system that turns social interest into nationalism, cooperation into military discipline, striving for significance into the willingness to die for abstractions. Alfred's thinking shifts. Before the war, individual psychology focused on helping individuals develop social interest despite neurotic patterns formed in childhood. The assumption was that society itself, while imperfect, provided a context for healthy development. The war destroys that assumption. Society can be sick, culture can be pathological, and when it is, individual adjustment isn't enough. The question becomes prevention rather than treatment. How do you create a society where social interest develops naturally, where children grow into adults who channel their striving toward contribution rather than domination, where the competition inherent in sibling rivalry and the inferiority inherent in childhood don't become weapons for fascism and war? The war ends in November 1918. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses. Vienna, once the capital of a vast empire, becomes the capital of a small impoverished republic. The old order is gone. Everything must be rebuilt. And Alfred, returning from 3 years of treating wounds that should never have existed, has a vision for what that rebuilding should look like. In 1919, he establishes the world's first child guidance clinic in Vienna. Not a medical facility in the traditional sense. Something new. A place where parents, teachers, and social workers collaborate to address children's behavioural and emotional problems before they calcify into adult neurosis. The approach is preventive. Intervene early, educate caregivers, reshape the environment, stop creating neurotics in the first place. The Social Democratic Party, now governing the new Austrian Republic, supports this work. They see education reform as central to building a democratic society. Adler's clinics, align perfectly with their goals. Within a year, there are multiple clinics operating. By 1930, there will be 30 such centres in Vienna, Munich, and Berlin. The format is revolutionary. Alfred conducts therapy sessions before an audience, not hidden behind closed doors, but in public view. Parents, teachers, social workers, anyone interested can attend and learn. This open forum approach democratizes psychological knowledge. You don't need medical training to understand children's behavior. You need insight into the patterns that create problems and the interventions that address them. The clinics teach specific principles: never beat or degrade a child. Physical punishment creates resentment, not cooperation. Don't pamper or create dependency. Overprotection prevents the development of competence and courage. Offer chances for reconciliation and making amends. Children need to learn that mistakes aren't final, that relationships can be repaired. At times, overlook defiance. Not every battle needs fighting. Sometimes ignoring minor misbehavior allows it to extinguish naturally. These ideas are radical in an era when authoritarian parenting is the norm. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Children should be seen and not heard. Obedience is the highest virtue. Alfred is proposing something different: democratic family structures, where children are respected as individuals, where discipline comes through natural consequences rather than imposed punishment, where the goal is developing social interest rather than enforcing compliance. He's also lecturing at Vienna's Pedagogical Institute, training teachers in these methods. Because the family isn't the only influence on child development. Schools shape personality, and traditional schools, with their emphasis on competition, ranking, and shaming those who fail, create exactly the feelings of inferiority that lead to neurosis or overcompensation. Alfred advocates for cooperative learning, encouragement rather than criticism, focus on effort rather than innate ability. A child struggling with math doesn't need to be told they're stupid. They need support, recognition of their effort, and belief in their capacity to improve. The teacher's role isn't to sort children into winners and losers. It's to facilitate each child's development of competence and social interest. This is family therapy before the term exists. Community psychiatry, decades before it becomes a recognized field. Alfred's approach involves everyone in the child's environment because he understands something crucial. You can't fix a child in isolation from the system that created the problem. A neurotic child usually has a neurotic family system. Address the individual all you want. If the family dynamics remain unchanged, the problem persists. The work spreads rapidly. Other cities establish similar clinics. Practitioners come to Vienna to train with Alfred. Publications disseminate the methods. Individual psychology is no longer just a theory. It's a movement with practical applications addressing real social problems. Alfred publishes extensively during this period. The Practice and Theory of Individual Psychology in 1920 collects his lectures and papers from 1912 to 1914, finally available to a broader audience. Understanding Human Nature in 1927 becomes his most accessible work, explaining individual psychology's core concepts for general readers rather than specialists. His writing style is deliberately non-technical. He wants these ideas understood by parents, teachers, social workers, not just psychiatrists, because the application of individual psychology isn't primarily in the consulting room. It's in homes, schools, communities, wherever human development happens. The political context matters. Post-war Vienna is experimenting with social democracy on a scale never attempted. The city government, called Red Vienna, implements massive public housing projects, healthcare programs, educational reforms. They're trying to build a society that serves working people rather than aristocrats. Alfred's work fits this vision perfectly. His socialism isn't Marx's class warfare. It's practical concern for how social conditions affect psychological development. Poverty, overcrowding, lack of education, these create environments where social interest can't develop. Children growing up in desperate circumstances don't learn cooperation and contribution. They learn survival and competition. Not because they're defective, but because their environment demands it. Change the environment, change the development. Provide decent housing, adequate nutrition, quality education, and you create conditions where social interest becomes natural rather than heroic. This is preventive mental health on a societal scale. Alfred's feminism also intensifies during this period. His wife Raisa remains politically active, and her influence continues shaping his thinking. In 1922, Alfred writes about gender equality with a clarity that won't become mainstream for decades. The masculine protest he'd identified earlier isn't about biology. It's about culture teaching everyone to equate masculinity with value and femininity with inferiority. Men suffer this fiction by feeling compelled to prove their masculinity through dominance, aggression, emotional suppression. Women suffer by internalizing inferiority or exhausting themselves, trying to compete on masculine terms. The solution isn't women becoming more like men or men becoming more like women. It's dismantling the hierarchy that ranks one gender above the other. These ideas get Alfred included in Thyra Boldson's memorial statue featuring 99 famous women and one man. The recognition matters because it's accurate. Among early psychologists, Alfred's advocacy for women's equality was genuinely exceptional. By the mid-1920s, Alfred's influence extends beyond Austria. He begins lecturing internationally. His first trip to the United States in 1926 introduces individual psychology to American audiences hungry for practical psychological approaches. Unlike Freudian psychoanalysis, which requires years of intensive treatment and focuses on unconscious conflicts, individual psychology offers accessible concepts and relatively brief interventions. Americans love it. The emphasis on self-improvement, on overcoming obstacles, on striving toward goals, aligns perfectly with American cultural values. Alfred returns repeatedly, lecturing at universities, training practitioners, building networks of supporters. His schedule becomes punishing, teaching in Vienna, running clinics, writing, traveling internationally for lectures and training. He's in his 50s now, and the pace is exhausting, but the sense of urgency remains. The war proved that civilization is fragile. Another catastrophe could come at any time. Psychology must contribute to preventing it by fostering social interest on a mass scale. The clinics continue expanding. By 1930, 28 child guidance centers operate across German-speaking Europe. Thousands of parents and teachers receive training. The open forum sessions mean that knowledge spreads beyond those directly involved. Attendees take what they learn back to their own families and schools. But while Alfred is building this infrastructure of prevention and education, forces are gathering that will destroy it completely. The economic collapse of 1929 creates conditions of desperation across Europe. And in that desperation, people don't turn towards social interest. They turn towards scapegoating, nationalism, authoritarianism. In Germany, the Nazi Party is rising. In Austria, fascist movements gain strength. The Social Democratic government in Vienna, which had supported Alfred's work, faces increasing pressure from the right. The progressive experiment of Red Vienna becomes a target for those who see social democracy as weak, decadent, a betrayal of traditional values. Alfred watches these developments with growing alarm. Everything he's learned about psychology tells him where this leads. The masculine protest taken to its logical extreme, the inferiority complex projected onto designated enemies, the striving for superiority twisted into the will to power over others, social interest replaced by tribal loyalty, and aggression toward outsiders. In 1932, the situation becomes untenable. Nazi influence in Austria is growing. Alfred, Jewish and socialist, promoting progressive ideas about child rearing and gender equality, is exactly the kind of person fascists target. The decision to leave isn't difficult. Staying means increasing danger. He accepts a position at Long Island Medical College in New York, the first chair of medical psychology in the United States. At 62 years old, Alfred is emigrating, leaving behind the city where he was born, where he built his practice, where he established the clinic system that proved individual psychology's practical value. The move is permanent. Vienna, which had been the centre of his world, becomes part of his past. The life he'd built there, the networks, the institutions, all of it left behind. Because fascism doesn't negotiate with psychologists about the nature of social interest. It eliminates them. Raisa comes with him after 35 years of marriage. Through the break with Freud, through the war, through the building of individual psychology into an international movement, they're starting over in a new country. Their children are adults now, making their own decisions about where to live and what to do. America offers safety and opportunity, but it also means starting from scratch in many ways. Building new networks, establishing credibility, training new practitioners. The work Alfred had been doing in Vienna, the integrated system of clinics and training and public education, that can't be simply transplanted to New York. The context is different here. In Vienna, Alfred had been part of an integrated progressive movement. The Social Democrats weren't just tolerating his psychological work, they were actively supporting it, funding it, building it into the education system. Child guidance clinics operating in schools, teachers trained in individual psychology principles, a whole society being reshaped around ideas of social interest and democratic child rearing. New York in 1932 doesn't have that infrastructure. There's no network of clinics waiting for him. No government support for radical educational reform. What exists instead is a medical establishment dominated by psychoanalysis, which means Freudian theory, the very approach Alfred spent 20 years arguing against. An American psychoanalysis in the 30s isn't particularly interested in a 62-year-old refugee with unconventional ideas about social interest and community feeling. They already have their theoretical framework. They already have their training institutes. They already have their professional hierarchies. Alfred's appointment at Long Island Medical College provides a base, but it's not the same as the Vienna position. He's teaching medical students who mostly want conventional psychiatric training, not revolutionary approaches to preventing neurosis through democratic child rearing. The lecture circuit becomes crucial. Alfred travels constantly across the United States, giving talks, conducting training sessions, meeting with educators and social workers. The same pattern he'd established in Europe, building the movement one lecture at a time. Except now he's doing it in a language that's not his first, in a culture he doesn't fully understand yet, at an age when most people are thinking about retirement. His energy remains remarkable. Colleagues describe someone who works constantly, writing, teaching, seeing patients, traveling. The mission hasn't changed. Psychology must serve humanity's welfare. Social interest must be fostered. Another catastrophe like the Great War must be prevented through proper education. But there's an underlying tension now. Alfred is building individual psychology in America while watching Europe descend into exactly the kind of disaster he'd been warning about. The masculine protest, the inferiority complex projected onto scapegoated groups, the striving for superiority twisted into fascist ideology. News from Vienna gets worse. In 1934, the Austrian government crushes a socialist uprising. The housing projects of Red Vienna, including buildings where Alfred's clinics operated, become battlegrounds. The progressive experiment is over, replaced by an authoritarian Catholic regime that's trying to maintain independence from Nazi Germany by adopting similar tactics. The child guidance clinics are closed, the trained teachers dismissed or silenced. Everything Alfred built over 15 years dismantled. Not because the work failed, because it succeeded too well at creating exactly the kind of critical, socially conscious citizens that authoritarians can't tolerate. And then in 1938, Germany annexes Austria, the Anschluss. Vienna becomes part of the Third Reich overnight. Whatever remained of Alfred's work, there is now completely gone. The Society for Individual Psychology dissolved, books burned, Jewish psychologists forced to flee or face worse. Some of Alfred's former colleagues make it out, others don't. The network he'd spent decades building is scattered across the globe or destroyed entirely. This isn't just professional setback. This is watching your life's work erased by the exact pathology you'd been trying to prevent. The masculine protest taken to its ultimate extreme. Fascism as collective inferiority complex. The striving for superiority becoming the will to dominate and destroy. But Alfred doesn't stop working. If anything, the urgency intensifies. Because now, it's not theoretical. The catastrophe is happening. Psychology's contribution to preventing it has become psychology's contribution to surviving it and building something better afterward. In America, he focuses on training practitioners. Individual psychology needs people who understand it deeply enough to apply it in schools, clinics, families. The movement can't depend on him personally. It needs institutional foundation. He establishes training programs, writes articles for American journals, publishes books aimed at general readers. The style remains accessible, practical, focused on application rather than abstract theory. Parents and teachers need to know what to do, not just what to think. The core principles stay consistent. Inferiority feelings are universal. Everyone starts life small, weak, dependent. The question is how you respond. Do you develop social interest connecting your striving to community welfare? Or do you turn inward, seeking superiority over others, using neurotic symptoms to avoid responsibility? Birth order continues to fascinate American audiences. The idea that your position in the family constellation shapes your personality, your style of life, your approach to problems. First children dethroned by younger siblings, second children always racing to catch up, youngest children either pampered or developing unique ways to compete, only children negotiating the world without sibling rivals. It's not deterministic. Alfred always emphasizes that birth order creates tendencies, not destinies. What matters is how you interpret your position, what meaning you assign to it, the lifestyle you construct in response. This focus on meaning, on interpretation, on the individual's creative power to shape their own development, this distinguishes individual psychology from the deterministic theories dominating American psychology. Behaviorism says, environment determines everything. Psychoanalysis says, unconscious drives determine everything. Alfred says you determine everything through the meanings you assign and the goals you pursue. It's an optimistic theory, maybe too optimistic for the late 30s, watching Europe tear itself apart. But Alfred maintains it. Humans are not prisoners of their past or their biology. They're creative beings capable of changing their lifestyle, developing social interest, contributing to community welfare. The question is how to foster that development, and that's where education becomes central. Not education as information transfer, education as character formation, teaching children to see themselves as part of a community, to find significance through contribution rather than domination, to develop the courage to be imperfect and the willingness to cooperate. American educators respond to this more enthusiastically than American psychiatrists do, because teachers work with normal development. They're trying to prevent problems, not just treat them afterward. And prevention is what Alfred's been focused on all along. He works with progressive education movements, gives talks at teachers' colleges, writes for education journals. The audience is different from the medical establishment, but the receptivity is higher. Teachers see the practical value immediately. One of his American students, Rudolf Dreikurs, becomes particularly important in translating Adlerian ideas into classroom practice. Dreikurs systematizes the approach to classroom management, developing techniques based on natural consequences and encouragement rather than punishment and competition. This partnership matters. Alfred's strength is insight, theory, the big picture. Dreikurs excels at systematic application, at creating methods teachers can actually use. Together, they build a practical pedagogy that spreads through American education. But Alfred's health is becoming a concern. The pace he's maintaining would exhaust someone half his age. He's 67 now, still traveling constantly, lecturing, teaching, still writing, still maintaining the private practice, still supervising trainees. People who work with him describe someone who seems tireless, but that's not quite accurate. The energy is real, but it's also driven by urgency. There's so much to do, so little time. Europe is burning, America might be next. Psychology must contribute to preventing that. In early 1937, Alfred embarks on another lecture tour. This one takes him to Europe, back across the Atlantic, to give talks in France and England and the Netherlands, places where individual psychology has followings, where practitioners are trying to maintain the work despite political pressures. The schedule is punishing. Multiple cities, multiple talks per day sometimes, long train journeys between venues. And Alfred is 67, recovering from a recent illness, probably should be taking it easier, but he doesn't, because the work matters more than personal comfort. If there's a chance to spread these ideas to train more practitioners, to prevent even a few more cases of neurosis or family dysfunction, then the discomfort is worth it. May 1937, Aberdeen, Scotland. Alfred is there for a series of lectures. He's been travelling for weeks. The schedule has been exhausting, but the talks go well. Good audiences, engaged questions, the kind of response that makes the effort worthwhile. On May 28th, he's walking down the street, going to deliver another lecture, and he collapses right there on the pavement. A heart attack, sudden, fatal. By the time help arrives, he's gone. 67 years old, thousands of miles from Vienna, alone in a city where almost nobody knows him personally. The news spreads slowly. No instant global communication in 1937. Word travels by telegram, by letter, by word of mouth. Alfred Adler is dead. The founder of individual psychology, one of the three giants who shaped modern psychotherapy, gone. Raisa is in New York. The children scattered. The funeral happens in Aberdeen because that's where he died. A small service, some local colleagues, people who knew his work but not the man. It's a strange end for someone whose entire theory centered on community, on social interest, on the importance of belonging. To die alone in a foreign city. But maybe that's fitting too, because Alfred spent his whole career arguing that significance comes from contribution, not from circumstances, and his contribution was already established, already spreading, already changing how people understood human development. The movement doesn't collapse with his death. That's the test of whether you've built something real, whether it depends on your personal charisma or has institutional foundation. Individual psychology passes that test. The training programs continue. The practitioners keep working. The ideas keep spreading. Dreikurs carries the work forward in America, developing it, systematizing it, applying it to education and family counseling. Other students establish training institutes in different cities. The international society persists despite the war that's coming, because less than 2 years after Alfred's death, Germany invades Poland. World War II begins. The catastrophe he'd been trying to prevent through psychology education, it happens anyway. Worse than the First War, more total, more destructive. And during that war, the Nazis implement exactly the pathology Alfred had diagnosed: the masculine protest as genocide, the inferiority complex projected onto designated enemies, the striving for superiority becoming the systematic murder of millions. Alfred didn't live to see it. That's probably merciful. Watching your worst predictions come true, watching everything you worked to prevent unfold anyway, that might have been unbearable. But his work survives. The ideas persist. Individual psychology continues developing after his death. New applications, new research, new practitioners. The foundation he built proves solid enough to support the growth. What remains now is to understand the legacy. Not just the theory, but the impact. How individual psychology changed psychotherapy, education, our understanding of human development, and how it continues changing them today. The legacy doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It seeps in slowly, changing things from the inside. Parents who've never heard Alfred's name are using his techniques. Teachers implementing his principles in classrooms. Therapists applying his insights without necessarily identifying as Adlerians. That's how ideas really spread. Not through declarations of influence, but through quiet integration into practice. Start with education. Rudolf Dreikurs takes individual psychology and translates it into practical classroom management. He's working in Chicago now, training teachers, writing books. The principles are simple enough that any educator can use them. Encouragement instead of praise, natural consequences instead of punishment. Democratic classroom structures where students have voice and choice. These aren't radical innovations by 1940s standards, but they're direct applications of Alfred's theory. The child guidance movement Alfred started in Vienna, that continues growing in America. Different form, same foundation. School counselors becoming standard in American education. Family therapy emerging as a distinct field. Both trace their lineage back to those open forum sessions in Vienna, where Alfred demonstrated how to work with entire family systems, not just isolated individuals. Birth order research explodes, not always accurately. People oversimplify, turn it into pop psychology. First children are natural leaders. Middle children are peacemakers. Youngest children are rebels. Alfred would have hated these rigid categorizations. He'd emphasized that birth order creates tendencies, not destinies. That the psychological situation matters more than the numerical position. But the core insight persists. Family constellation shapes personality development. Your position relative to siblings creates challenges and opportunities that influence how you approach life. Then there's the inferiority complex. The term enters common language. People use it casually, often inaccurately. He's got an inferiority complex becomes shorthand for low self-esteem. That's not quite what Alfred meant. He was describing something more specific. The feeling of incompleteness that drives all human development. The gap between where you are and where you want to be. The tension that motivates growth when managed well. Neurosis when handled poorly. But the fact that the term became part of everyday vocabulary, that matters. It means Alfred identified something people recognized in their own experience, named a phenomenon that felt true. Even if the popular understanding got simplified, the basic insights stuck. Everyone feels inadequate sometimes. Everyone's trying to compensate for perceived deficiencies. Everyone's striving towards some vision of completion. Psychotherapy itself changes because of Alfred's influence. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the field moves toward his positions gradually. Greater emphasis on social factors in mental health. More attention to conscious goals and future orientation. Less fixation on childhood trauma. Therapeutic relationships becoming more egalitarian, less authoritarian. Clients viewed as collaborators in their own healing, not passive recipients of expert interpretation. Cognitive behavioral therapy, when it emerges in the 1960s, has Adlerian DNA, the focus on how thoughts shape feelings and behaviors. The emphasis on changing maladaptive patterns through conscious choice. the collaborative therapeutic stance. Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, the founders of CBT, they're working independently, but they're cultivating ground Alfred had already prepared. Reality therapy, developed by William Glasser, incorporates individual psychology principles. The emphasis on choice and responsibility. The focus on present behavior rather than past causes. The idea that people can change their lives by changing their actions. Glasser never claims to be purely Adlerian, but the influence is obvious. Humanistic psychology, the third force in American psychology after behaviorism and psychoanalysis. That movement embraces Adlerian concepts enthusiastically. Abraham Maslow quotes Alfred frequently. Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy shares the Adlerian emphasis on equality, respect, and the client's inherent capacity for growth. The whole humanistic movement, with its focus on meaning, purpose, and human potential, its working territory Alfred had mapped decades earlier. But here's what's strange. Despite this massive influence, Alfred doesn't get proper credit. Not like Freud or Jung. Ask educated people to name important psychologists. They'll mention Freud. Maybe Jung, Pavlov, Skinner. Alfred, he's known within the field, but not to the general public. Not really. Why? Partly timing. He died in 1937, right as Europe was descending into catastrophe. World War II dominated attention. The Holocaust destroyed the European psychoanalytic community. Many of Alfred's colleagues and students didn't survive. The institutional infrastructure that might have preserved and promoted his legacy was shattered. Partly, it's about drama. Freud's theories were shocking, sexual, controversial. Jung dealt with archetypes and collective, unconscious, mystical, and profound. Alfred's ideas were practical, sensible, focused on everyday social functioning. Less exciting, less scandalous, harder to sensationalize. And partly, it's because Alfred's insights got absorbed so thoroughly that people forgot where they came from. When an idea becomes common sense, you stop attributing it to anyone. Teachers use encouragement without knowing they're applying Adlerian principles. Parents implement natural consequences without recognizing the theoretical foundation. Therapists take collaborative stances without citing Alfred as the source. This creates a peculiar situation. Alfred wins in practice while losing in recognition. His ideas shape how psychology is actually done, but his name fades from popular consciousness. It's the fate of certain thinkers. They're so right that everyone eventually agrees, then forgets who convinced them. The Adlerian societies persist though. Training institutes in New York, Chicago, London, elsewhere. They maintain the tradition, train new practitioners, publish journals. The North American Society of Adlerian Psychology forms in 1952. The International Association of Individual Psychology continues coordinating work globally. These organizations keep individual psychology alive as a distinct approach, not just a set of techniques absorbed into generic practice. Dreikurs becomes the movement's leader in America after Alfred's death. He's a brilliant organizer, a compelling teacher, a tireless promoter. He writes books that make Adlerian principles accessible to parents and teachers. Children? The Challenge becomes a bestseller in 1964, introducing millions of readers to democratic parenting based on Alfred's theories. Dreikurs establishes training centers, develops systematic programs for therapist education, creates a network of practitioners who identify explicitly as Adlerians. But even Dreikurs can't prevent the dilution. By the 1970s, individual psychology is competing with dozens of other therapeutic approaches: Gestalt therapy, transactional analysis, family systems theory, cognitive behavioral therapy, various humanistic and existential approaches. The field is fragmented. There's no longer a simple divide between psychoanalysis and everything else. Now there's a marketplace of competing theories, each with its advocates and evidence base. Individual psychology maintains its niche. It's particularly strong in education and parent training, less prominent in clinical psychology, where CBT and psychodynamic approaches dominate. The Adlerian journals continue publishing research, but they're not the prestigious outlets that shape the field's direction. The work continues, but it's not center stage. Does this represent failure? Depends how you measure success. If the goal was building a dominant school that controlled the field, then yes, Alfred's movement failed. Freudian psychoanalysis had that dominance for a while, then lost it. No single approach controls contemporary psychology. The field is too large, too diverse, too empirically driven for any one theory to dominate. But if the goal was changing how people think about human development, about mental health, about the relationship between individual and society, then Alfred succeeded beyond what any single person could reasonably expect. His core insights, they're embedded in how modern psychology operates. The emphasis on social factors, the attention to subjective experience and personal meaning, the focus on goals and future orientation, the therapeutic relationship as collaboration between equals, the integration of psychology with education and social reform. These are Adlerian contributions, whether or not people acknowledge the source. Think about what's changed since Alfred's time. Psychotherapy is no longer reserved for the wealthy. It's become democratized, accessible, covered by insurance in many cases. That was Alfred's vision. Mental health services integrated with education and community support. That's happening, imperfectly, but increasingly. Child development understood in terms of family systems and social context, not just individual pathology. That's standard now. The specific techniques have evolved. Contemporary Adlerian therapy looks different from what Alfred practiced. More structured, more evidence-based, more integrated with other approaches. But the underlying philosophy remains consistent. People are creative, self-determining agents. Their problems make sense in context. Change happens through insight, encouragement, and practical action. The therapeutic relationship is the vehicle for growth. One area where Alfred's influence remains particularly strong is in understanding lifestyle and patterns. The concept that people develop consistent ways of approaching life's challenges, that these patterns form early and persist, that they're based on private logic and subjective interpretations. This framework continues organizing how Adlerians think about personality. It's less deterministic than Freudian theory, more focused on coherence and purpose than behavioral approaches, more practical than existential therapy. The lifestyle assessment, a structured interview process Adlerians use to understand a person's basic orientation toward life, that's a direct descendant of Alfred's approach. You explore family constellation, early memories, birth order, relationships with parents and siblings. You identify patterns in how the person pursued belonging and significance. You discover the private logic underlying their choices. Then you use that understanding to help them recognize where their approach is working and where it's creating problems. It's detective work, collaborative investigation. The therapist isn't an expert imposing interpretations. They're a consultant helping the client understand their own patterns and consider alternatives. This stance, it's become standard in many forms of therapy, but Alfred pioneered it. He demonstrated that effective therapy doesn't require the analyst to be a distant, authoritative interpreter of unconscious material. You can work with people as equals, respecting their intelligence and autonomy, while still offering expertise and guidance. The encouragement process Alfred developed that remains central to Adlerian practice is not the same as praise. Praise focuses on outcomes and creates dependency on external validation. Encouragement focuses on effort and builds internal motivation. You notice what people are attempting, not just what they achieve. You acknowledge the courage it takes to try, to risk, to persist, despite difficulty. You help them recognize their own progress and capability. This distinction between praise and encouragement, It's influenced education profoundly. Growth mindset research by Carol Dweck, that's exploring similar territory. When you praise intelligence or talent, you create fixed mindset, fear of failure, dependence on validation. When you acknowledge effort and strategy, you build resilience and motivation. Different language, same basic insight Alfred had developed decades earlier. Social interest, Gemeinschaftsgefühl, that concept continues generating discussion and research. How do you measure it? How does it develop? What interferes with its formation? Contemporary Adlerians have created scales to assess social interest, studied its relationship to mental health outcomes, explored how therapy can enhance it. The research supports Alfred's intuition. People with stronger social interest have better mental health, more satisfying relationships, greater resilience in facing challenges. But the concept remains somewhat elusive. It's not just altruism or empathy or social conformity. It's something deeper, a fundamental orientation toward belonging and contributing. A sense that your welfare and others' welfare are intertwined. That meaning comes through connection and contribution, not through domination or isolation. You can't reduce it to simple behaviors or attitudes. It's closer to a worldview, a way of being. This might be why social interest hasn't been absorbed into mainstream psychology as thoroughly as some of Alfred's other concepts. It's harder to operationalize, harder to measure, harder to manipulate experimentally. The research exists, but it's not central to contemporary theory, the way, say, attachment or self-efficacy have become. Individual psychology maintains social interest as a core construct, but the broader field hasn't fully embraced it. Still, the underlying insight persists in different forms. Positive psychology's emphasis on meaning and contribution, the research on prosocial behavior and its benefits for well-being, the growing recognition that individualism has costs, that connection and community matter for mental health. These are all touching territory Alfred had identified as fundamental to human thriving. What about the criticisms? Every theory has them, and individual psychology is no exception. Some researchers argue the evidence base is thin, that Adlerian concepts are hard to test empirically, that the approach relies too much on subjective interpretation. Fair points. Alfred wasn't focused on building an evidence base. He was developing practical techniques based on clinical observation. The systematic research came later, and it's never been as robust as the research supporting cognitive behavioral or psychodynamic approaches. Birth order research has produced mixed results. Some studies find effects consistent with Adlerian predictions, others don't. The relationship between birth position and personality seems weaker and more complicated than Alfred suggested. That doesn't invalidate the basic insight that family constellation matters, but it complicates the simple correlations people sometimes assume. The lifestyle concept, while clinically useful, is difficult to validate empirically. How do you objectively measure someone's basic orientation toward life? The assessment process relies heavily on therapist interpretation of early memories and family patterns. Different therapists might reach different conclusions about the same material. This subjective quality makes the approach feel less scientific than contemporary psychology typically demands. But here's the thing, psychotherapy isn't purely scientific. It's part science, part art, part relationship. The demand for complete empirical validation of every concept and technique, that's relatively recent. Alfred was working in an era when clinical observation and theoretical coherence mattered more than experimental verification. His approach reflected those values. Whether that's a strength or weakness depends on what you think therapy should be. The evidence that does exist generally supports Adlerian practice. Studies comparing individual psychology to other approaches find comparable outcomes. Research on specific techniques like encouragement, natural consequences, family constellation work, that shows positive results is not the massive evidence base that CBT has accumulated, but it's sufficient to establish that Adlerian therapy works for many people dealing with various problems. And effectiveness isn't just about symptom reduction. Alfred's vision of mental health was broader. He wanted people to develop social interest, to find meaning through contribution, to build satisfying relationships, to approach life with courage and resilience. These outcomes are harder to measure than depression scores or anxiety levels, but they're not less important. Maybe more important, actually, because they represent fuller human functioning, not just absence of pathology. Contemporary Adlerians continue developing the approach. They've integrated findings from attachment research, neuroscience, developmental psychology. They've created more structured treatment protocols for specific disorders. They've built training programs that meet modern professional standards. The field hasn't remained static since Alfred's death. It's evolved, adapted, incorporated new knowledge while maintaining core principles. Some of this evolution Alfred might not recognize. He was working before brain imaging, before attachment theory, before the cognitive revolution in psychology. Contemporary Adlerians talk about neural pathways and implicit memory and affect regulation. These weren't concepts available to Alfred, but the integration happens in service of his basic vision. Understanding how the brain works doesn't contradict the insight that people are goal-directed social beings. It provides additional layers of explanation for phenomena Alfred observed clinically. The question isn't whether individual psychology has remained pure. It hasn't, and it shouldn't have. The question is whether Alfred's core insights continue informing practice, whether the vision of psychology he developed, practical, social, educational, democratic, whether that vision still guides the work. And largely, it does. Adlerians in 2024 are doing therapy that Alfred would recognize as consistent with his principles, even if the specific techniques and theoretical elaborations have developed considerably. The influence question extends beyond professional psychology. Alfred's ideas seeped into popular culture, into education, into how ordinary people think about themselves and others. Sometimes the influence is direct and acknowledged. More often it's invisible, absorbed into common sense without anyone remembering where it came from. Take the concept of inferiority complex. Everyone knows that term. People use it casually to describe someone who seems insecure or overcompensates for perceived weaknesses. Most users have no idea they're invoking Adlerian psychology. The phrase has become part of everyday language, detached from its theoretical origins. That's both success and failure. Success because the idea reached mass consciousness. Failure because the nuance got lost in translation. Alfred never said everyone has an inferiority complex. He said everyone experiences feelings of inferiority. That's different. The complex develops when those feelings become overwhelming, when compensation fails or takes destructive forms. The popularization flattened the concept, made it simpler and less useful. But it spread the basic insight that perceived inadequacy drives human behavior in ways worth examining. The same pattern appears with other Adlerian concepts. Birth order research entered popular psychology so thoroughly that people discuss it at dinner parties. Without knowing, Alfred pioneered the field. Self-help books reference lifestyle patterns without citing individual psychology. Parenting advice about encouragement versus criticism, about avoiding both pampering and neglect. These draw on Adlerian principles that have become conventional wisdom. Is that influence or dilution? Maybe both. Alfred wanted his ideas to reach beyond academic circles, to change how people actually lived. He got his wish. The cost was precision. Popular psychology simplifies everything, turns complex theories into bullet points and quick tips. Adlerian thought survived that process better than some alternatives, because Alfred himself communicated accessibly. He wrote for general audiences, gave public lectures, worked with teachers and parents. The translation to popular culture was already underway during his lifetime. Educational influence runs deeper and more direct. Progressive education movements from the 1920s onward incorporated Adlerian principles. Democratic classrooms, student council participation, emphasis on encouragement rather than punishment. These reflect Alfred's vision of how children should be treated. Rudolf Dreikurs, one of Alfred's most important students, developed specific applications of individual psychology to classroom management and discipline that influenced teacher training programs worldwide. The idea that children misbehave because they're discouraged, that addressing the underlying discouragement works better than punishment. This became foundational in many educational approaches. Positive discipline, developed by Jane Nelson, explicitly builds on Adlerian principles. Millions of parents and teachers have used those techniques without necessarily knowing they're applying individual psychology. Democratic parenting, the notion that children deserve respect and should participate in family decisions appropriate to their age, this was radical when Alfred proposed it. Now it's mainstream, at least in theory. The shift from authoritarian to authoritative parenting, from obedience-based to relationship-based discipline, Alfred contributed significantly to that transformation, even if he didn't cause it single-handedly. But influence also means being misunderstood, misapplied, blamed for interpretations you never endorsed. People have used Adlerian concepts to justify approaches Alfred would reject. The emphasis on encouragement got twisted into permissiveness. The recognition of lifestyle patterns became excuse-making. Social interest, which Alfred saw as requiring genuine contribution and connection, sometimes gets reduced to shallow niceness. Critics point to these misapplications as evidence the theory is flawed. That's not entirely fair. Every influential idea gets distorted in transmission. Freud didn't intend his work to justify blaming mothers for everything. Behaviorists didn't mean to reduce humans to stimulus response machines. The gap between original formulation and popular reception affects all psychological theories. Alfred's fate in that regard isn't unique. What is unique is how thoroughly his ideas disappeared into the background. Freud and Jung remain household names. Their theories, even when simplified, get attributed to them. Alfred's contributions often go unacknowledged. The inferiority complex, the importance of birth order, the value of social connection, these entered psychology's vocabulary without his name attached. That's partly because he didn't create a cult of personality around himself. He wasn't interested in fame for its own sake. He wanted ideas to spread, to help people, to change society. He got what he wanted, with the ironic result that most people using his ideas don't know they're his. Is that success or obscurity? Depends on how you measure influence. If the standard is name recognition, Alfred lost to Freud and Jung decisively. If the standard is practical impact on how people think and act, his record looks better. His ideas became infrastructure, invisible because they're everywhere. The professional influence waxed and waned across decades. Individual psychology thrived in the 1920s and 1930s, particularly in Vienna and the United States. Alfred's lecture tours, his teaching positions, his extensive publications built a substantial following. Training institutes were established. Journals were founded. The Society for Individual Psychology grew into an international organization. Then came the Nazi period and World War II. The Vienna School was destroyed. Many Adlerians fled or died. The institutional base that Alfred had built over decades disappeared almost overnight. The American branch survived but struggled. Psychoanalysis dominated clinical psychology. Behaviorism dominated academic psychology. Individual psychology found itself squeezed between these larger forces, lacking the institutional power and resources to compete effectively. The post-war period was difficult. Psychoanalysis claimed the couch. Behaviorism claimed the laboratory. Where did individual psychology fit? It wasn't quite medical enough for psychiatry, not experimental enough for academic psychology, too therapeutic for education, too educational for therapy. The interdisciplinary nature that made it innovative in the 1920s became a liability in an increasingly specialized professional landscape. But it never disappeared completely. Adlerian institutes continued training therapists, journals kept publishing, conferences brought practitioners together. The approach survived in pockets, maintained by people who found it clinically useful regardless of theoretical fashion. And gradually, as psychology moved toward integration and eclecticism, Adlerian concepts found new relevance. Cognitive therapy's emphasis on how beliefs shape behavior resonates with Alfred's focus on private logic and lifestyle. Humanistic psychology's concern with meaning and growth echoes Adlerian themes. Family systems therapy's attention to family constellation and interaction patterns develops ideas Alfred pioneered. Contemporary attachment research validates his early insights about the importance of belonging and connection. These parallels don't always get acknowledged. CBT therapists working with core beliefs might not realize they're doing something conceptually similar to Adlerian lifestyle assessment. Family therapists analyzing triangulation patterns might not know Alfred was exploring family dynamics before family therapy existed as a field. The influence operates through conceptual similarity rather than direct citation. Recent decades have seen renewed interest. New training programs have formed. Research on Adlerian approaches has increased. Books introducing the theory to contemporary audiences have found readers. The approach never went away, but it's more visible now than it was in the 1970s or 1980s. Some of this reflects broader trends. Psychology's movement toward integration makes eclectic approaches like individual psychology more appealing. The growing emphasis on prevention and wellness aligns with Alfred's original vision. Social interest has gained particular attention as mental health professionals recognize that individual therapy often isn't enough, that community context matters, that social connection predicts well-being as strongly as any other variable. Alfred's emphasis on Gemeinschaftsgefühl looks prescient. The loneliness epidemic, social fragmentation, declining civic engagement, these contemporary problems are exactly what Alfred warned about when he argued that social interest was essential for both individual and collective health. His critique of materialism and competition resonates in an era of increasing inequality and environmental crisis. The argument that striving for superiority over others produces neurosis while striving for mastery and contribution produces health. This speaks to contemporary concerns about narcissism, status anxiety, and the psychological costs of hyper-competitive culture. Alfred was diagnosing these problems 90 years ago. They've only intensified. The educational applications continue developing. Positive discipline programs based on Adlerian principles operate in schools across multiple countries. Parent training in Adlerian methods reaches hundreds of thousands of families. Teachers learning democratic classroom management are applying concepts Alfred developed in the Vienna child guidance clinics. The impact might not carry his name, but the lineage is clear. Corporate applications have emerged more recently. Leadership training programs incorporate Adlerian concepts about encouragement, belonging, and contribution. Team-building exercises use principles from individual psychology. The emphasis on psychological safety in organizations reflects Adlerian insights about how people function best when they feel valued and connected. Again, direct attribution is inconsistent, but the ideas are there. The question of whether Alfred would recognize or approve these applications is complicated. He was pragmatic about adapting ideas to different contexts, but also insistent on certain core principles. Democratic relationships, social equality, concern for community welfare, these weren't negotiable. Would he endorse using his psychology to make corporations more profitable? Only if those corporations were also becoming more socially responsible, more democratic in structure, genuinely concerned with employee well-being rather than just productivity. He'd probably be pleased that his ideas reached so far beyond the consulting room. That was always his goal. Therapy was important, but prevention and education mattered more. Changing how children were raised, how schools operated, how communities functioned, this was the real work. Individual therapy helped people already struggling. Systemic change could prevent struggle in the first place. Whether that systemic change has actually occurred is debatable. We have democratic families and progressive schools, but also persistent inequality, social fragmentation, and psychological distress on a massive scale. Alfred's vision hasn't been realized, but the vision itself remains available, embedded in individual psychology's principles and practices. The tools exist. The question is whether we'll use them. Contemporary Adlerians face the challenge of maintaining tradition while remaining relevant. How much can the approach change before it stops being Adlerian? How much must it change to address contemporary problems? These tensions play out in training programs, in theoretical debates, in clinical practice. Some Adlerians emphasize fidelity to Alfred's original formulations. Others prioritize adaptation and integration. Both positions have merit. Both have risks. The fidelity position preserves what made individual psychology distinctive, prevents dilution into generic eclecticism. But excessive attachment to historical formulations can make the approach seem dated, disconnected from current knowledge and practice. The integration position keeps the approach relevant, incorporates new findings, speaks contemporary language, but it risks losing what made Adlerian psychology different, blending into the therapeutic mainstream until the distinctive contribution disappears. Finding the balance requires understanding what's essential versus what's historical artifact. Alfred's specific theories about organ inferiority or masculine protest, these were products of his era. They can be updated or replaced without losing the core. But the emphasis on social context, on goal-directed behavior, on encouragement and belonging, on practical intervention aimed at empowerment, these seem more fundamental. An Adlerian approach that abandons these principles has lost something essential regardless of how much contemporary research it incorporates. The influence question ultimately can't be answered definitively. Measuring impact across multiple domains over decades using different criteria produces different conclusions. By some measures, Alfred's influence was enormous, by others modest. What's clear is that individual psychology didn't dominate professional psychology the way psychoanalysis or behaviorism did. It didn't become the standard approach, but it contributed concepts, techniques, and perspectives that enriched the entire field. And it provided an alternative vision of what psychology could be. Not just a medical specialty or an experimental science, but a practical discipline aimed at helping people live better, more meaningful, more connected lives. That vision hasn't been fully realized, but it hasn't been refuted either. Alfred left a personal legacy that deserves examination beyond theoretical contributions. The man himself, not just the ideas. Who was he when the lectures ended and the books closed? He died suddenly. May 28th, 1937, in Aberdeen, Scotland. He was 67 years old, on a lecture tour, still working, still teaching, still trying to spread his message about social interest and human potential. He'd been walking to the university when he collapsed on the street, heart attack, dead within hours. The circumstances feel appropriate somehow. Not retired, not withdrawn from the world, but actively engaged until the end. He died doing what he'd spent decades doing, trying to help people understand themselves and each other better. There's something very Adlerian about that ending. Purpose maintained until the final moment. His personal life had been complicated. The marriage to Risa lasted, but wasn't always smooth. She remained politically active throughout their lives together, more radical than Alfred in some ways, maintaining connections to socialist movements while he moved increasingly toward mainstream acceptance. They had fundamental disagreements about politics and social change, She wanted revolution. He wanted evolution. Their children navigated, being Adler's offspring, in different ways. Alexandra and Kurt both became psychiatrists, carrying forward aspects of their father's work. But they also had to find their own identities, separate from his shadow. Being the child of someone famous in any field creates pressures. Being the child of a psychologist who wrote extensively about child development and family dynamics must have been particularly strange. Did Alfred practice what he preached? By most accounts, yes. His children described him as encouraging, democratic in his approach to parenting, genuinely interested in them as individuals. But he was also absent frequently, travelling constantly in his later years, dedicating enormous energy to his professional mission. The tension between family commitment and world-changing ambition affected him like it affects anyone trying to do both. He wasn't perfect, nobody is. He could be stubborn, convinced of his own correctness, dismissive of approaches he considered wrong-headed. The break with Freud revealed someone capable of burning bridges when he felt his ideas weren't being respected. He didn't suffer fools gladly, and his definition of fool could be rather broad. But colleagues also described warmth, humour, genuine interest in people. He'd stop to talk with anyone, treating the janitor and the university president with equal respect. The democratic ideals weren't just theoretical, they shaped how he moved through the world. His relationship with Judaism is worth noting. He was born Jewish but converted to Christianity in 1904, probably for pragmatic reasons rather than spiritual conviction. Anti-Semitism limited professional opportunities in Vienna. Conversion opened doors. He wasn't particularly religious in either tradition, but the cultural background shaped him regardless. The rise of Nazism in the 1930s forced recognition of what that background meant. Jewish by birth, regardless of conversion, he fled Austria in 1932 as Hitler's influence grew. His books were burned, his clinics closed, everything he'd built in Vienna was destroyed. He spent his final years in America, establishing new connections, starting again at an age when most people retire. That resilience defined him. Childhood illness, professional conflicts, forced migration, none of it stopped the work. He kept pushing forward, kept teaching, kept trying to make psychology useful for ordinary people facing ordinary problems. His writing style reflected his personality. Clear, direct, accessible. He wrote for teachers and parents and general readers, not just fellow professionals. Some academic psychologists dismissed his work as too simple, too popularized. But simplicity was the point. Complex ideas presented clearly serve more people than complex ideas presented complexly. Compare his prose to Freud's. Freud wrote beautifully, with literary flourishes and cultural references that made his work compelling but also exclusive. You needed certain cultural background to fully appreciate Freud's writing. Alfred wrote plainly. Anyone literate could understand him. That democratic impulse extended to language itself. His lectures were apparently mesmerizing. Students described him as engaging, funny, able to hold attention for hours. He used examples from his practice, from daily life, making abstract concepts concrete. Teaching wasn't just information transfer, it was performance, connection, inspiration. But he also made mistakes. Some of his theoretical formulations haven't held up. The organ inferiority concept proved too narrow. Some birth order predictions were overgeneralized. His understanding of homosexuality reflected his era's prejudices despite his progressive stance on most social issues. Nobody gets everything right, and judging historical figures by contemporary standards misses the point. But the errors exist. What matters more than the errors is the approach. Alfred demonstrated that psychology could be practical, optimistic, focused on strength rather than pathology. That contribution transcends which specific theories proved correct. The orientation itself was revolutionary and remains valuable. His final years in America brought new challenges. He was establishing himself in a different culture, working in a different language, navigating different professional norms. He adapted, as he'd always adapted, but the adjustment required energy he might have preferred directing toward other work. He published less in his final years, more lecturing, less writing. Perhaps the immediate connection of teaching became more important than the delayed impact of publication. Or perhaps exhaustion was setting in. He'd been working intensely for 4 decades, the pace finally catching up. His death was sudden enough that unfinished business remained. Projects planned but not executed. Ideas developed but not fully articulated. Students trained but not as thoroughly as he'd hoped. This is how most lives end. Mid-sentence, the work incomplete. The funeral in New York drew large crowds. Colleagues, students, patients, people he'd influenced directly and indirectly. The tributes emphasized his humanity, his kindness, his dedication to making psychology serve human welfare. Also, his humor. Multiple speakers mentioned his wit, his ability to find absurdity in human pretension, including his own. Reiser outlived him by 20 years. She continued political activism, maintained connections with socialist causes, lived to see some of the social changes they'd both advocated for. Whether she felt his death as loss of partnership or liberation from a complicated relationship, we don't know. Probably both. His children carried aspects of his legacy forward, but also moved beyond it. Alexandra became a prominent psychiatrist in her own right, contributing to neurology and mental health treatment. Kurt practiced and taught individual psychology, but also integrated other approaches. Neither became mere guardians of their father's flame. They evolved, adapted, made their own contributions. That's probably what Alfred would have wanted. Not preservation, but evolution. Ideas that continue developing rather than calcifying into dogma. He criticized Freud partly for the rigid orthodoxy that developed around psychoanalysis. Individual psychology should avoid the same trap. The personal qualities that made him effective also created limitations. His optimism about human potential sometimes led him to underestimate how difficult change actually is. His faith in education and social reform didn't fully account for structural barriers and entrenched interests. His belief that people could overcome inferiority feelings through effort and encouragement didn't always acknowledge how trauma, poverty, and oppression constrain possibility. But the optimism itself had value. Psychology in his era was dominated by deterministic theories. Freud saw people as driven by unconscious forces they couldn't control. Behaviorists saw people as shaped by conditioning beyond their awareness. Alfred insisted people had agency, could make choices, could change their lives through understanding and effort. That insistence mattered even when overstated. It gave people hope. It suggested therapy could be brief and practical, rather than endless and archaeological. It positioned the therapist as collaborator rather than expert authority. These weren't small contributions. His personal life demonstrates something important about living according to one's principles. It's hard. Really hard. Democratic parenting while traveling constantly creates contradictions. Advocating for social equality while achieving professional success creates tensions. Believing in community while pursuing individual recognition creates dilemmas. Alfred navigated these contradictions imperfectly, like everyone does, but he navigated them consciously, trying to align behavior with values even when that alignment proved difficult. That effort itself teaches something. Not that perfect consistency is achievable, but that striving for it matters. The question of what he'd think about contemporary application of his ideas is unanswerable, but interesting to consider. He'd probably be pleased that individual psychology survived, that training programs exist, that practitioners worldwide use his concepts, but he'd also likely criticize how the approach has been depoliticized, stripped of its social justice dimensions, turned into just another therapeutic technique. He definitely object to self-help distortions of his work. The inferiority complex became pop psychology shorthand, often misused. Birth order became party conversation fodder, oversimplified beyond recognition. These popular misunderstandings bothered him during his lifetime. They'd bother him more now, but he'd also recognise that influence means losing control. Once ideas enter culture, they transform in ways their originators can't predict or prevent. That's not entirely bad. It means the ideas have vitality, that people find them useful enough to adapt them. Purity and influence rarely coexist. His legacy isn't primarily in specific theories. Most have been modified, integrated, or superseded. His legacy is in the vision of what psychology could be: democratic, practical, optimistic, socially engaged. That vision remains relevant precisely because it hasn't been fully realized. Contemporary psychology has become more democratic in some ways, more accessible, less elitist, more diverse, but it's also become more commercialized, more individualistic, more disconnected from social context. The gains Alfred would celebrate, the losses he'd mourn. The man who died on that Aberdeen street was someone who'd spent his entire adult life trying to help people live better. Not richer or more successful in conventional terms, but more connected, more purposeful, more genuinely themselves. That mission defined him from his medical practice among circus performers through his final lecture tour. Whether he succeeded is complicated. Individual psychology didn't transform the world the way he hoped, but it influenced thousands of therapists who helped thousands of clients who went on to raise children differently, teach students differently, relate to others differently. Ripple effects extending outward in ways impossible to trace, but undeniably real. Alfred Adler wasn't a saint. He was a complicated person with strengths and weaknesses, successes and failures, admirable qualities and frustrating limitations. Understanding him as fully human makes his contributions more impressive, not less. He didn't need to be perfect to create something valuable. The ideas he developed remain available. The techniques he pioneered still work. The vision he articulated still inspires. That's legacy enough. The small funeral in Aberdeen wasn't the end. Not really. Ideas don't die when their creators do. They keep moving, transforming, finding new applications in contexts their originators never imagined. Alfred spent his life arguing that people aren't prisoners of their past, that we're creative beings who construct our futures through the meanings we assign and the goals we pursue. His own legacy proves the point. Individual psychology didn't freeze in 1937. It evolved, adapted, integrated new knowledge while maintaining its core insight. Humans are social creatures whose psychological health depends on connection, contribution, and the courage to be imperfect. The world he left behind was descending into the very catastrophe he'd warned against. The masculine protest becoming fascism, the inferiority complex projected onto designated enemies, social interest collapsing into tribalism and violence. He didn't live to see the full horror of what came next, but he diagnosed the pathology decades earlier, understood that psychology without social conscience was complicit in the systems that create suffering. Whether we've learned that lesson remains questionable. We have more therapists, more research, more sophisticated understanding of human development. But we also have persistent inequality, social fragmentation, and psychological distress on scales that suggest we're still not getting something fundamental right. Maybe that's the real measure of Alfred's relevance, not whether his specific theories proved correct, but whether the questions he raised remain urgent. How do we foster social interest in a culture that rewards competition over cooperation? How do we help people develop belonging in an increasingly atomized world? How do we prevent the feelings of inferiority that drive both individual neurosis and collective violence? These aren't solved problems. They're permanent challenges requiring each generation's attention. Alfred provided tools for addressing them: encouragement instead of criticism, democratic relationships instead of authoritarian hierarchies, focus on contribution instead of domination. The tools remain useful even as the specific contexts change. The boy who woke up next to his dead brother, who heard a doctor pronounce him worthless, who couldn't walk for years, became someone who believed humans could overcome their circumstances through courage and community. That transformation wasn't magic. It was the same process he'd later describe as compensation, taking your deepest vulnerability and building something meaningful from it. His life was the theory in practice, and the theory, despite its limitations and the ways it's been misunderstood and misapplied, still offers something worth preserving: a vision of psychology as more than symptom management. As a practical discipline aimed at helping people live with purpose, connection, and the recognition that their individual flourishing depends on the flourishing of others. The grave in Aberdeen holds his body. The ideas keep moving.